Hello, everyone. I'm Sally Kinney, and welcome to the second half of Season 2 of Deconstructing Rape, the podcast for academics, survivors, and activists seeking to understand and mobilize to prevent sexual violence. In Season 1, I spoke with survivor scholars about their experiences of sexual violence and their research findings. In Season 2, I talked with scholar activists about public policies to hold perpetrators of sexual violence accountable, erode rape culture, prevent sexual violence, and help survivors heal. Each episode contains sexually explicit content and adult language. Use discretion when listening. Nancy Whittier received her BA, MA, and PhD in sociology from The Ohio State University. She spent her academic career at Smith College, where she is now a full professor and the Sophia Smith Distinguished Professor of Sociology. Temple University Press published her first book, Feminist Generations, The Persistence of the Radical Women's Movement, in 1995, which explored how the time in which they entered the movement profoundly shaped activists' political ideologies, policy preferences, views of engaging the state, and even patterns of organizing. I taught this wonderful text in my graduate feminist organizations class at the University of Minnesota. Oxford University Press published her The Politics of Child Sexual Abuse, Emotion, Social Movements, and the State in 2009, and also Frenemies, Feminists, Conservatives, and Sexual Violence in 2019. She teaches classes on gender, sexuality, social movements, statistics, and research methods. Of special interest to this conversation is her specialized expertise as a scholar of social movements, with a particular focus on movements to end sexual violence and gender-based violence. So Nancy, I just want to say welcome to the program. I've been an admirer of your work for a long time, and let's jump in. So you come from a long line of distinguished scholars who study feminist social movements from The Ohio State University, and your last two books have focused more narrowly on the issue of sexual violence, first on child abuse, and then gender-based violence. And as a policy scholar and activist who's also dabbled in the social movement scholarship, questions of agenda setting, and the role of emotions in social movement mobilization, I strongly believe that feminists could benefit enormously from the insights and strategy from a social movement lens that your work provides. Sociologists, historians, political scientists, and policy scholars have all tried to understand how an issue comes to be on the public agenda and start with the insight that agenda status is an achievement of political actors who must persuade us to understand or frame the problem from their perspective, as well as persuade us that it is a problem that government action can address and that a particular solution is the right one, rather than an inevitable function of some quality of the issue. You call the work of coming out publicly as survivors of sexual violence visibility politics, but recognize that although it may be necessary, it is not sufficient for policy change. So how do you think we get feminist social movements to focus on policy development and implementation in addition to raising awareness or agenda setting?
I mean, that's such a good question, and it's such a hard one. I think part of the answer is that different organizations or activists can do different things, right? So there certainly are feminist organizations that are focused on policy implementation, both like narrowly within government agencies, writing model bills, that kind of thing, and then also a little bit outside of the kind of immediate thinking about, well, what would a policy on a certain issue look like? I think to some degree that happens more around issues other than sexual violence, workplace equity, college admissions, how to deal with social media use by teens, all of those kinds of issues that are really important, but maybe a little bit less charged, that don't have the kind of visibility, invisibility, secrecy, shame mix that sexual violence has. I think your point that putting something on the agenda is really just one step in the process is a really important one, right? Because an issue can be on the agenda and it can be addressed in very, very different ways. some ways that feminists would support and others that we would not. Um, so
Who do you
I
see
think,
as doing the best work out there? I mean, you talk about kind of the insufficiency of protest politics if it doesn't also have the sort of insider element, the people who know the legislative staffers and those sorts of things. And I wonder how much of it is a lack of infrastructure, or even if it's a question of a lack of really even developing policy proposals, because we're just kind of stuck in this Groundhog Day of awareness raising. So we don't actually have clear policy proposals to consider. Or do you see that is there something that's maybe shifted in our kind of expertise with the success of the Violence Against Women Act, that people are kind of developing that policy expertise?
I mean, I think, there was a coalition of sort of professionalized and legal advocacy organizations that were really important in not just writing the initial Violence Against Women Act, but revising it and working on its reauthorizations. And I think that's a good example of of a network that was pulled together specifically to work on that topic, right? So it had feminist legal organizations, it had service providers, it had, people who were in that coalition in their role as a professional, but also had an activist side. Um, so I don't know that there's any, I think good policy implementation has to be done by a diverse group, right? Or policy development. It's got to be done by a group that brings various perspectives. And it is, it happens differently federally versus on the state level, right? I think
Or
a lot of
campus.
states, or campus level, right? So it's going to be organizations with some local knowledge that can pull together the stakeholders or the people with different kinds of expertise to develop that. At the moment, I think at the federal level, it's like a waste of time, right? Nothing's going to happen
Right,
there.
nothing's happening at all.
But a lot is happening, at state levels around a lot of different issues.
And campuses.
And campuses.
Right.
And, I assume corporations, like kind of all the other organizational players where there are some openings.
Yeah.
All of those are trying to deal with what it means, what the federal climate means.
Well, that's one of the
which
things that I think is really relevant. This is kind of jumping ahead, but your first book was really looking at kind of what happened to the feminist movement in the 1980s, which felt like the end of the world at the time when Ronald Reagan was elected, and feminists felt that they no longer had state support for what they were trying to do, and was very demobilizing. I lived in the UK at the time, and during Margaret Thatcher, all of kind of state feminism was completely defunded, and people were like, well, we can't do feminism then if we don't have funding, and there was a lot of floundering around. What do you think we've learned from surviving that period as somebody who's really looked carefully in the 80s, but then has kind of seen now more the long view?
Yeah, that's a great question. I've been thinking about that a lot over the past, 6 or 8 years. And, I wish I could say what we learned is that we don't need state funding, but in fact, it was really demobilizing to lose all of those funding streams. I think it really did contribute to kind of pushing, especially feminism, but also some racial equity efforts. It did contribute to decreasing those. And what I found when I got into the research for my second book on child sexual abuse is that there were some funding streams that remained, but fewer and smaller and more specialized, and that in turn kind of channeled the movement or some parts of the movement in those directions, right? So there was some funding around, training police departments to be more sensitive to child survivors, right? So somebody who might have had a government contract to do feminist empowerment self-defense, now they could maybe get a government contract to teach the local police something. And, so it pulls the movement in directions that you wouldn't necessarily choose to go.
I'm glad you raised that, because that was one of the questions that I had, is sort of what happened to the feminist self-defense movement. That's a puzzle that I've had too. But of course, one of the things that's particularly problematic that a lot of people have written about, including you, is how state funding limits people's activism and policy advocacy. And I feel like not only is the example you have of one thing being funded rather than another, but we have this sort of vilification of DEI and feminist work, even naming that, which is more intense. So that's something Rose Corrigan has written about, that by taking funding, then feminists got the money to provide social services for survivors, but had their hands tied about doing advocacy, and that part of the movement really was shortchanged. How do you see that?
Yeah, I agree completely. And I think Rose Corrigan's work on that is really, really clear. And, it's not that there's no one who's interested in doing advocacy. There's still advocates who aren't funded. There are still protesters, but those people have to make a living some other way. And that's another big difference from compared to the 80s, right? It is a lot harder to make a living now in some other way, right? We've got much greater economic inequality, less purchasing power by people who are maybe working the kinds of jobs that in the 80s you could work 20 hours a week and, kind of make things work and be an activist in the rest of your time. But now people are working way more than that. There's just less kind of flexibility to live a underfunded activist life. So, I think in terms of people's availability of time,
well, I hadn't really thought about that, but of course that's true. We just, with the funding of higher education, so people being more strapped while they're kind of in their 20s and students really decreases that sort of 1970s ability to go to a meeting every night on an issue and take action that way. One of the things that I think has been interesting that we see with activists and people is you talked about the role of the Centers for Disease Control in 2002 and 2003, and really kind of reframing the child abuse movement as a public health problem. Can you talk a little bit, and that was to benefit from kind of the lessons and successes from smoking and drunk driving. Can you talk a little bit about the pros and cons of using a public health approach rather than focusing on, for example, patriarchy or male violence?
Yeah, and I'll bracket for a minute the way public health has changed in the past 5 years. So just kind of setting that aside, I think the advantage of a public health approach is the same thing as the peril, which is that it is a non-political approach, right? So it is an approach that should be able to play in any context, right? It's not linked to a feminist agenda, even though it's kind of informed by one. So it should be applicable in conservative or liberal contexts, right? And then that has the risk of course, neglecting some of the important structural causes of child sexual abuse. But what led people to a public health approach was what led advocates there is really that they had the hope that it would improve prevention, right? As opposed to treatment and services after the fact, right? If you want to think about how to prevent child sexual abuse or any form of sexual violence, you have to think about that's what public health does, right? It thinks on a population level about how you can decrease something that has detrimental effects on people, how can you decrease that without having to target each individual instance, right? So how can you develop vaccine policy that will eliminate polio without having to think about, little Susie got polio at the pool and, each individual case. And so in terms of sexual violence, when you have something that is really widespread on a population level, and I'm sure you've heard this from other people, right? Advocates feel like it's this constant stream of cases that they're trying to deal with. And is there some way to kind of reduce that?
Right, crisis management. But it seems to me the problem with thinking about prevention is, well, the empowerment self-defense would be one thing, and that's been very difficult to bring back. But the other thing is kind of the framework in Sexual Citizens is the prevention approach is sex education. And of course, that's the most politicized thing there is. So in terms of, policy proposals, establishing a kind of feminist-oriented anti-sexual coercion sex education seems really out of reach in red states and conservative places. And so I'm not sure, then how, if that is true, how do we benefit from that prevention framework then?
I mean, I think the prevention framework can also include various efforts to change men's behavior or change adults' behavior in the case of child abuse. And those are problematic too, right? There's some good sociological writing on how some of these efforts targeting men really sort of elevate men as these heroes who can prevent sexual violence. But there is some evidence on child sexual abuse that the incidence has gone down. It's really hard to get good data, but it looks like maybe it's decreased a bit. And whether that's got to do with, prevention and education efforts or just something else, I don't
just
think we know.
A wider awareness that I think is...
But wider awareness is a public health approach.
Yes. Right? Good point.
Yeah. So like if bystanders will intervene or if things that would have been normalized are not normalized, right? That is kind of the consequence of a public health approach. It's not what we would want. It doesn't feel very empowering. It doesn't challenge the family or patriarchy. But it might have some.
It might reduce certain incidences. I think one of the things you argue, and I agree, that we have achieved nothing short of a revolution in the way we understand child sexual abuse, if not necessarily, as we're discussing, the equal success in preventing it. And I actually find it an enormously advantageous thing that men survivors of particularly clergy abuse or Boy Scout leaders have really organized, joined the movement, and litigated. But I do sometimes wonder if feminists have only been successful now that we're joined by men, like it hurts men too, so therefore it must be bad. How do you think about these developments?
Yeah, I mean, I wonder the same thing you do. I mean, I do think just in terms of historical chronology, in terms of visibility, women got there first. Right. And if it weren't for what women survivors of child sexual abuse and other forms of sexual violence did, it would have been much harder for the male survivors, organizations or individuals to, get any foothold. And, certainly male survivors talk about how much harder it is to get men to speak out in any way because of the kind of the stigma. The men are not supposed to be victimized in any way. And then if they're victimized by a man, there's the kind of added layer of homophobia. So on the one hand, I think the men are standing on the shoulders of the women. But they have, in terms of like the big institutional cases, they have been successful in ways that, I'm trying to think of in ways that women survivors haven't. And I'm trying to think about,
the civil litigation thing is interesting because what you talk about is that, survivors, particularly for incest, many of them wouldn't want to sue a parent, even if they could. that's different. The Boy Scouts aren't winning by suing their Boy Scout leader.
Exactly.
Right. It's the
Yeah.
third
And
party institution, and then they're not actually, the money isn't trickling down to them. I think that's the comparison with the campus. You sue the campus institution, and you might have more success than holding your individual perpetrator accountable on campus.
yeah, I think that's a good point.
Or the
And
gymnasts, the same thing.
right.
Although that is an example where you had both individual perpetrators and institutions ultimately found responsible.
Yeah, and I think the legal landscape in terms of institutional responsibility for child sexual abuse is really different from the institutional responsibility for adult sexual assault,
Oh,
right?
good
Because
point.
with child sexual abuse, the
Right.
question of consent, the defense of consent is impossible, right? Whereas with adults, we know all of the ways that rape accusations can be dismissed and or undermined legally. So I do, I think it's easier to sue the Boy Scouts than it is to sue or successfully than it is to successfully sue a campus, right?
Well,
And
although I
this is
have to say
setting
that the Boy
aside.
Scouts, I thought the campuses were as bad as the Catholic Church until I started reading about the Boy Scouts, and I think the Boy Scouts really are the worst.
I mean, it really is like it is egregious and terrible. And the other thing about the Catholic Church is that the media attention goes to cases of boys, but there were many, many girls who were sexually assaulted by priests as well and have received some settlement money. It just doesn't get the same kind of media attention,
I
which I
was
think goes back to your original question about what is it about, you know, men's position that lets the cases of assault against boys or men get so much more attention.
Yeah, although when learning about the Boy Scouts, you can't, it's weirdly makes me feel a little less despair because I always feel like it's the profound devaluation of women and girls, and they didn't care about boys either. So, it's
Right.
it's so egregious. Well, let me just shift attention for a second. So you've written a lot about engaging the state, and in their book on feminist institutions, Myra Marks Ferry and Patricia Yancey Martin argue that the issue is not whether feminists should engage the state, but when and how. And I think that's really your position that you've just reiterated here. And one of the things I most admire about your work is that you don't join a long line of the, I think, powerful and sometimes often dominant strand of thinking within feminism, also within gender studies programs, that the disappointments and shortfalls of feminist activism and quite valid criticisms of the movement's racism and other shortcomings should lead us to the conclusion that these failures arise from the wrong-headed decision to engage the state in the first place. So in Frenemies, you describe engaging the state as unavoidable if filled with dangers, particularly around sacrificing an intersectional approach. And I think that's actually one of the most powerful points about Frenemies. And you deploy a social movement analysis to show how after putting the issue on the agenda, the feminist movement against child abuse lost control of its framing. And I argue that we see a lot of the same thing with respect to the #MeToo movement. And so we talked about this issue of focusing on raising awareness. But what do you think are some of the lessons feminists could draw about this loss of control of the policy framing once the government does take up the issue on the agenda?
Yeah, I mean, I think one thing is that it really is unavoidable, right? That so I think there can be a lot of recriminations against activists for the very fact that they are successful enough that they lose control of their agenda and their framing, right? Because in order to be successful, it has to be taken on by the elites, whether in government or the media. So less recrimination would be one lesson. But the other thing is that if there are organizations that are continuing to do the work of putting forward the desirable policy changes, doing maintaining a more challenging frame, that I think can help to keep
the pressure on.
To keep the pressure on and to move things at least a little bit in the right direction. I mean, we could opt out of engaging with the state, but the state is still there, right? No matter what.
Right. But one of the things I think that you argue, and I think this is something I've been thinking about a lot, is you talk about, and this comes up most, I think, recently with the crime frame. So, and the discussions around carceral feminism, but you sort of say, both the state and the media have this, what you call kind of selection bias. So that if you put this issue on the agenda, they're only going to take it up within the existing frames. And you even talk about kind of sometimes just the structural and institutional thing about which congressional committee gets assigned the issue of child abuse. Right. And so that being a way that that selection bias is perpetuated. And so that is a real conundrum, right? Because one of the things that you identify, for example, with the selection bias of the media is to kind of strip away from the story the collective action aspects and really focus on the individual account. And we see that all the time in social movement stories, from Rosa Parks or whatever. Here's this individual that has no social context when in fact the person emerged from this really powerful collective action moment and strategizing. So do you think things have changed since you wrote about those cases with the Me Too, that maybe some of that selection bias in the media has been overcome? One thing I've wondered if just the kind of the presence and the failure to completely thwart their reporting of particular kind of feminist journalists, whether it's Ronan Farrow or it's Megan Twohey and Jodi Kantor, that those kind of folks maybe still have the same constraints in the media, but they're pushing the envelope, I think, in a way that is really positive.
Yeah, I agree. And I think, journalists have more opportunity to reach audiences independently than they used to, right? You've got people with their newsletters who are making a living in that way, or somewhat of a living. And I think social media, for all of its problems, it also has allowed individuals to participate in that discourse. And I think Me Too is a perfect example of that, right? The kind of explosive rise of Me Too accounts on social media, and then that spilled over into, I don't want to say institutional change, because I don't really think there's been institutional change, but certainly at least a moment of greater social awareness, of individuals reframing their own experiences or sharing their experiences, and some temporary penalties for some men. The media is less, the mainstream legacy media is much less consolidated than it used to be. It's weaker, right? It occupies a smaller slice of the pie. That's the wrong metaphor, but
right.
People are getting their news
it's
from
more
social
fragmented
media.
Yeah,
it's much more fragmented, so that does open up opportunities maybe for more disparate voices. It also makes it harder to achieve a kind of more widespread cultural shift, because it's harder to reach a larger segment of the population. So, it's kind of a double-edged sword.
Well,
right?
And I think it's more polarized too. So
Yes.
You have people reaching the people who are reaching a large audience are reaching more of a large audience of their side, rather
Yeah.
than kind of the middle of everybody, the Walter Cronkite or whatever. Yeah.
Right. Right. Or even like, the Good Housekeeping, the women's magazines, those kinds of things, right, that reached a really broad cross section. And those were so important for raising the issues of sexual violence. But there's nothing like that now. I
Although
have not had,
the mommy blogs or
right, right.
it's
And,
interesting.
even those I think have
No,
fragmented.
I agree.
Yeah. And, I do wonder, one of the things I realized writing the child sexual abuse and then writing Frenemies is that one of the reasons that sexual violence is an issue that sometimes crosses partisan lines is that, of course, it occurs across partisan lines, right? And so at certain moments, women on the right or in evangelical Christianity who were not sympathetic to feminism at all became aware of the discourse coming from feminists about sexual violence and use that to reflect on their own experiences and then to push for change within their own institutions, within their own congregations or denominations or whatever. So I am very curious about what is happening on the right around these questions of sexual violence at the moment. I have not had the time or frankly the stomach to go and hang out in those
Right.
online settings and try to figure it out. But
Well, there have been some pretty powerful kind of individual survivor narratives and films and things like that from that perspective.
yes.
From Mormons or other religious institutions, and I think, yeah, I think that would be that would be a really interesting question, and so that it is. I always think of that sort of like the GLBTQI plus group, and it doesn't. There's going to be the same percentage of people in every political framework, and then they're going to have to deal with how people within their communities regard their identities. So maybe that's an example of the kind of political neutrality or the depoliticization of the survivor community creating opportunities. That's what I really saw as when I first heard David Lezak speak and heard the men survivors organizing on my own campus, I kind of thought, oh, we kind of missed the boat when we polarized things to not include all kinds of survivors with the kind of Brown Miller perspective or whatever. And I think that it does provide some opportunities, although and Dell Hollander would be another example of somebody, really writing, within the gymnast community, but very much from a Christian point of view. So I think there's a lot of folks out there with a kind of individual narrative about its presence, its harm, the institutional complicity and stuff, not necessarily so much the policy aspects. Right. So we talked about the selection bias. Another thing I think that's really important in your work is really, particularly when you're talking about the vilification of the engagement with the state, is rather than blaming the wrong-headed feminist strategy, saying, the problem is there was a counter movement, and the counter movement organized really effectively. And you document the Repressed Memory Foundation work, which I actually feel, I don't know if you feel the same way, I feel like that battle has that dragon has been slayed a little bit. At a great, great cost, which you really document, like the individual litigation against, people who wrote The Courage to Heal and individual therapists and stuff. But that, I don't know if the kind of last, nail in the coffin was Me Too, but I feel like that has been a real successful response. But I also wonder what you think, because you write about the counter movement for the anti-pornography movement, and I feel like the pornography movement, unless I don't know if you think about its kind of successor being people working on trafficking. But I feel like that the counter movement really completely stopped that movement in its tracks, and most feminists kind of abandoned work on that issue. But I feel like it was successful in kind of sort of saying, the harm is not explicit sex or immoral sex, but the harm is violence against women. And that framework became part of the Violence Against Women Act, even though it was ultimately that ability to litigate using that framework was ultimately overturned by the Supreme Court. But it did reappear in the Title IX guidelines, right? Mm-hmm. And so how do you see that as kind of the long arc of that issue, in the same way that you talk about the role of feminists, helping frame clergy abuse by kind of laying the groundwork? And I was just going to say one thing about that too, is that the argument that you made about the clergy abuse boys and girls standing on the shoulders of feminists was the same argument John D'Amelio made about the AIDS movement, right? He said, the AIDS movement got a lot of its framework, its strategy, all of that from the women's health movement. So I think that's another parallel. But how do you think about that? Do you see that as kind of like a glimmer of success of the pornography movement shining through there?
I mean, I don't know if it's a success of the anti-pornography movement so much as it is the long career of Catherine McKinnon trying to put forth, thinking about ways that violence against women is a civil rights issue, right? So, her clerks or former clerks or former students were really important in putting that component into the Violence Against Women Act. That would allow individual women to sue under civil rights statutes. And then, they also influenced the Title IX, some of those Title IX formulations. So that her approach first became widely known outside of academia in the anti-pornography work. But I don't know that you can trace a direct line from the anti-pornography feminists themselves to those other instances of taking a civil rights approach, but definitely, McKinnon and the networks that she formed within and outside feminist movements were really influential. And I think, there's a lot to be said for taking a civil rights approach because it is not medical, it's not legal. And one of the things I argue in my work is that the dominant remedies and ways that policy have been formulated on sexual violence are, either it's a medical and psychological issue that should be treated individually, or it's a criminal issue and people should be prosecuted. And, both of those reinforce existing institutions that are really problematic in how they treat women and people of color and so forth. So they're not liberatory approaches. And there are limits to civil rights law and a civil rights frame as a liberatory approach too, right? It's not a panacea, but at least it is another angle.
Right, and it thinks about the harm differently.
Right, it thinks about the harm in terms of rights as opposed to in terms of like a psychological injury.
And equality. Right. So
Yes.
that's what I thought was so powerful, even though I feel like the counter movement ultimately was completely successful, is to say, the harm of, sexual assault on campus is denying women equal educational opportunity. That's
Right.
a very different framing. And, if it can be sustained, which I think is very hard. Can you say a little bit more about this issue of kind of who has control of the issue with professionals in terms of therapists, social work, or whatever, and those folks having discursive control, and also how you think about professionals, because this dichotomy between kind of grassroots organizers and professionals is somewhat of a false one, because feminist therapists themselves can be survivors. They can be feminist activists who use a feminist frame. So it's not a very tidy category, but still, how do you think about kind of that issue about kind of losing? We talked about losing the collective action frame in the media, but also kind of losing that link with survivors.
Yeah, I mean, one of the things I argue is that early on in the process of an issue getting on the agenda and just sort of defining the issue, beginning to formulate policy, early on, non-experts or people with direct experiential authority have more influence. And then as time goes on, credentialed expertise becomes a more important form of authority that in sometimes redefining the issue and then formulating responses. So, with sexual violence, we have such a long time frame now from when these issues entered public consciousness and entered the government agenda, but also entered the professional associations, right? Social workers, therapists, in the case of physical child abuse, right? Pediatricians. So early on, the people, the experts, the professionals who got involved, many of them did it because either they had direct experience or they had sort of political and social change commitments that led them in that direction. And certainly there are still people like that, but it also has snowballed. So now, you've got a really multiple generations, professional generations of people who are coming to this work without any of that background. Mm-hmm. So I do think it has those voices dominate, right? Expertise and professional knowledge really do dominate now that the issue is so well established and entrenched. At the same time, we have a kind of transformation in medical care going on. There are shortages and burnout and insufficient, too few social workers, too few therapists. I wonder about how kind of the institutional change in the structure of those professions might play out. Whether they will maintain their kind of authoritative position in the discourse or not, I don't think we can know over time. The other thing that's really interesting that's happening in terms of kind of decentering expertise is social media, right? There's a lot of kind of peer lay analysis of mental health.
Right. Everybody can have their own podcast.
Yeah. Or, if you're young, you can have a TikTok.
Exactly.
And, I hear from my students, right, they're TikTokers talking about, their experiences with sexual violence and what they're doing to cope with it. And, so it's different from the survivors groups of the 70s and 80s that were face-to-face and mutual. But I think it is a new form of like another outlet where discourse that isn't controlled by institutions or by expertise can really flourish. So I think the jury is really out on how that's going to play out over time.
And another thing that you've really written about is the role of emotions in social movement mobilization. And I feel like even though there's been a lot of, concern about the social movement thing as opposed to the consciousness raising group being more anomic or kind of less engaged, I think there's still enormous potential for that kind of emotional connection and mobilization with these elements in popular culture, whether it's watching a TikTok, whether it's watching a video by Chanel Miller, whether it's reading a survivor thing. It can create the same kind of emotional connection. I'm not alone. I now see all these things too, so even if the person isn't sitting next to you in a room, the pervasiveness of those, which, as you say, kind of bypasses the made-for-TV movie, which may depoliticize things more, as a kind of personal transformation growth thing, I think it has potential. What do you think about that?
Yeah, I agree. I mean, I think emotions are central to pretty much every social movement and most policy areas. And in some, they're more explicit, and others, they're more submerged. And I think, when you're dealing with an issue that has really intense emotional meaning for people, right? Whether it's people who have gone through sexual violence, survivors, or their family and loved ones, or when you're trying, people who don't have any experience with direct personal experience with it also have, emotions of
Right.
horror or fear or sympathy or whatever. So, yeah, I think providing spaces for people to take what could be personal emotions and transform them into collective emotions that might be the basis for some kind of social action, I think is really important. And I do think social media, the communities that form on social media have the potential to do that. Um, I mean, I think it still takes another step beyond that, right? But if you have people who have been participating, watching these TikToks and commenting or receiving comments or whatever, those people are then primed. They're in a different state of readiness for some kind of collective action. And
It's
that might be collective action on sexual violence issues, but it might also be collective action on other issues.
Of course, the danger is that gets channeled into kind of the criminal response, which is oftentimes where people channel their emotional
Right.
reactions to sexual violence is, kind of off with their heads, a kind of approach,
Right.
or, burn them out of my neighborhood. And I think that's what's really interesting about listening to survivors is that survivors often do not have those retributive feelings. They want an apology, they want prevention or something like that, rather oftentimes. And so we don't listen to them. But I feel like that's really been one of the dangers. And I don't know if you have any thoughts about kind of this complete disaster of our sex offender registry policy. I think I'm right on this, but, Patty Wetterling and the Wetterling Foundation, when they advocated for that, what they had in mind was, something that would be like, when the police can stop the car and see that this person has stolen a car, they can see that this person is a registered sex offender or something like that, rather than notifying neighbors and, excluding people. And I think the Wetterling Foundation and others have really retreated from any support. But it seems like that the sex offender registry stuff has a whole evil momentum of its own. That's really driven by that kind of like, we must do something.
Yeah, I think it is really a disaster and counterproductive. I don't think it decreases child abuse or people's vulnerability to sexual violence. I think it I just think it's a complete disaster. And one of the things I wrote about in Frenemies is that, sex offender registries, the congressional hearings about them, all of the public discourses about strangers, the stranger who abducts and
Right.
assaults someone. But those policies apply to familial abuse as well.
Right. Or
They can apply
teens.
to
Yeah.
elder siblings, so they can be applied in cases of statutory rape where people are close in age. There even have
Right.
been cases where they've been tried to apply to teenagers who were sexting. So And it doesn't work, right?
It's
It
not
doesn't work.
making
If it
anybody
worked,
safer.
it's not making anybody safer, and it's putting tremendous burden on especially the families of registered sex offenders, and it's making those people more isolated, more socially marginal, which makes them more likely to reoffend.
Yeah.
So it's a disaster in every way. And I really appreciate what Patty Wetterling and the Wetterling Foundation have done, not just in retreating, but they have really spoken out against sex offender, especially the notification laws. And, most people are not going to do that, right? There's nothing to be gained politically
Right.
by saying, let's not do this.
I stand with sex offenders.
Right. So somebody like Patty has the moral
Yeah.
authority to do that, right? Nobody's going to accuse her of being on the side of sex offenders.
Right.
And, if you haven't talked to her, she would be an amazing guest. She's
I actually door knocked for her when I lived in Minnesota and she ran for Congress.
Okay.
She is amazing.
But it's going to take people like that who have kind of unimpeachable credentials as being on the side of survivors to try to unwind some of the sex offender notification laws. And I'm frankly not very optimistic, although it would be ironic if, the fact that we have a Republican administration full of sex offenders, maybe that could provide some, unlikely alliances.
I hadn't thought of that as a bright spot before.
Yeah, it's not really a bright spot, but we have to take what we can get.
So let me say, I'm almost out of time here. I got to pick and choose carefully here.
Okay.
Because there's, I could talk to you all day. So I guess maybe I'd like to end with, because we already talked a little bit about the 80s comparison. I'd like to end with kind of your thoughts about intersectionality and carceral feminism and thoughts about those issues. One of the things you identify, you talked about, the dangers of having professionals take control of the discourse, and they are people who maybe don't kind of have that movement framework that connects to the wider issues. And I'm just still kind of reeling about your obvious connection with kind of the changes in economic marginality that affect who can do movement politics. And that seems like such an obvious insight from thinking across multiple issues. But you sort of say, too, one of the dangers of having single issue organizations, and it's one of the great puzzles and mysteries and disappointments, I think, of the feminist movement is the way, even though there's been kind of this big umbrella around violence against women, but child sexual abuse, sexual violence, and domestic violence really are kind of separate lanes, separate organizations, people specializing in those things, and there isn't a lot of connections between them, even though some people try, and people have funded some of those. But you say one of the dangers of being kind of the single issue thing is a greater likelihood that you won't have an intersectional approach. And so I wonder what your thoughts are about that. Do you, in terms of we see, and you also really write, I mean, this is true across your work, from the work that you do, your first book on feminist generations, you talk about you have to really understand these movements as embedded in a field, and there's other things going on at the same time. So how do you see kind of the significance of Me Too being embedded in a field that also includes Black Lives Matter at this kind of historical moment? Does that increase our prospects for a more intersectional approach going forward?
I think it's promising. I mean, one of the things about all of my work is that up until now, I've been writing in a time when social protest was at a pretty low level, right? When movements there wasn't much mass mobilization. And now we are in a really different movement context. There's a lot more mass mobilization, right? Protests, but also a lot more organizations. And so we're at kind of another peak that is similar to the 60s, where we have not been since then. So I think there's more possibility for cross-fertilization. I think Black Lives Matter is a really good example of a movement that is deeply intersectional, right? They're centering feminism, they're centering queer liberation, class inequality alongside racial liberation. So
and environmentalism.
Me Too,
Yeah.
similarly, right? So I don't think we know yet, but I think there's possibility. The issue with the sexual violence and where that fits in, aside from Me Too, is that we've got this just entrenched, professionalized field that the credibility of that field, especially in this moment, kind of rests on their ability to appear apolitical. So I'm not sure how it's all going to
So
come
that's
together.
a kind of countervailing pull.
Yeah, but I do think in a period of mass mobilization, things are mixing together. I've been doing some observation and data collection around slogans and signs at some of the recent mass demonstrations, anti-Trump, no kings. And there are a lot of signs and speeches that address sexual violence, right? Sexual harassment and assault, and, through slogans about what Trump says. But that's bringing that issue into a movement that is also deeply about race and gender and class. So I mean, I never want to predict the future with any confidence, but something different is happening. That just in the present, something different is happening with sexual violence, which has been for so long kind of walled off from other progressive causes. It makes an appearance in feminist specific events, but it doesn't really cross over. Now it's there.
It's
right?
interesting.
Kind of at the center. So I hope that means something good.
That's interesting. Well, I can't wait to see what comes next, and I can't wait to see what you do next. So thank you so much for your work.
Likewise.
And thank you for being on the program. Thank you very much.
All right. Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.
I owe a debt of gratitude to many who contributed to the second half of Season 2 now that I have moved home to Iowa. Music credit goes to the talented Jerry Lee Kenny on saxophone and to the late Dwight Champagne for his original composition, Surrender. Thanks to all my new friends and colleagues at Amplified in Des Moines, Amner Martinez, Laura Rodriguez, Aki Petavine for production and edging me into video. I would also like to thank the many students in my classes on rape and gender-based violence over the years for all I have learned from them, my rape pen pals, and my newfound community of those working to end sexual violence in Iowa, in particular through the Iowa Coalition Against Sexual Assault. Lastly, I'd like to thank the many survivors, not just scholars, who disclosed to me as students over the last 37 years, especially those in the Louisiana Correctional Institute for Women, 13 of whom just received their undergraduate degrees from Tulane University in October, and the Homestead Correctional Institute for Women. Your courage, humor, resilience, and determination to find joy showed me the way.